everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Ohio primary election results on both the Republican and the Democratic side and breaking down some of the key takeaways from this important primary. Now this really is the start of the primary season for the 2022 midterms. I know we had Texas back in March, but this is when the primaries are really going to start being kicked into high gear, and I'm going to try to cover as many of them as I possibly can. I know Pennsylvania's is on May the 17th. I want to try and live stream those primary results if I can, because it's a super important primary, and it's both on the Senate and the governor's level. On both sides, you have really competitive primaries, so I want to try and cover that if I can. But let's break down these results now while we have them. Of course, for the U.S. Senate on the Republican side, we have Trump-endorsed JD Vance walking away with it. Honestly, I didn't expect him to win by as large of a margin as he did, but as it stands right now, he's leading pretty comfortably for a pretty crowded field. You have, basically 6 people here running for the Republican nomination. I don't know if there's more that just aren't on here, but you have 6 people on here who ran for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate from Ohio, and JD Vance has 32.2% of the vote, and the next closest would be Josh Mandel, who's trailing him by about 9 percentage points. So a really big victory, I would say, for such a crowded primary. And, Josh Mandel, Matt Dolan, we're all within 10 points of each other. So these were the 3 main contenders. And Matt Dolan is an interesting character because I really hadn't heard about him until like 2 weeks ago when he started surging for whatever reason in the polling here. Now, he was never in first place except this one poll here by Blueprint Polling, but he was becoming a close second. He was overshadowing even Josh Mandel. Now, Matt Dolan kind of is running as a never Trump conservative, kind of like a Ben Sass type character in the sense that, he doesn't really support President Trump, but he supports all of his policies. And that's kind of what he campaigned on. And it was a message that really only resonated in the urban areas of Ohio, places like Columbus and Cleveland, and also areas over there. Again, his percentage in northeastern Ohio wasn't really too strong outside of areas like Cleveland. Of course, you have southern Ohio, which was completely dominated by Vance. If Dolan wanted to be competitive at all, he would have had to have won Hamilton County by a decent amount, and he lost it by over 3 percentage points. He would have had to have done just better overall in these urban areas, but he didn't. He should have maybe done better in places like Toledo, areas like that. But Josh Mandel was the favorite up until the Trump endorsement, basically, of JD Vance. If we go back to the polling from early on, this was Josh Mandel's race to lose, and ultimately, when Trump endorsed JD Vance, the polls flipped on a dime, and he ended up leading in the polls until now. He's winning pretty comfortably for a race that's this crowded. He has a 9-point margin of victory about, and 95% of the vote is in. Again, I'm recording this late at night or early in the morning, depending on how you view it. But I don't expect these results to really change by the time this video is out. It's going to be roughly the same. So a resounding victory. Again, when we were earlier in the night, when I was watching the election returns come in, there were a lot more different colors on this map. You had a lot more green, a lot more yellow. And as more and more of the votes solidified, as more precincts came in, especially from these rural areas, JD Vance was the favorite. And he really has to thank the rural Ohio voters for giving him such a resounding victory. And of course, Hamilton County as well, home of Cincinnati, which Matt Dolan, had he won by a decent percentage point, would have been a lot more competitive than Vance. But I still don't think it would have overcome these massive margins in the rural counties. We go down, of course, to the Democratic Senate primary. Tim Ryan really ran away with this. He had a progressive challenger in Morgan Harper, but she really didn't gain a whole lot of traction. Obviously, there was a giant fundraising differential. Tim Ryan was endorsed by the party before the primary, and as a result, he colossal landslide throughout the primary across the entire state. Again, we look at the governor's race now. Mike DeWine, which I said back in probably was a couple months ago now, I made a video on the most vulnerable Republican incumbents, and he was on this list. And that video really wasn't to say that these Republicans were vulnerable in the sense that they could lose, but that they were vulnerable enough to where they had, sizable primary challengers that, in a rare circumstance could win. And Mike DeWine's in an interesting position because he only garnered 48.1% of the vote as an incumbent Republican governor in the state of Ohio. Jim Renacci, who was the second place, came in 28, and Joe Blystone, who won a lot of these southern and central rural counties, came in third place. And the interesting thing enough, if you add the totals of these two candidates together, they would have beaten Mike DeWine. So, a lot of more America First conservatives were very upset with this outcome, given that Renacci or Blystone, one of them didn't drop out to endorse the other, in the weeks leading up to this primary, which ultimately led to Mike DeWine winning by a super comfortable margin, over 20 percentage points. And this was about what the polling had told us in the governor's race. If we go back to the Ohio governor's race and we look at the polling here, originally Renacci was a favorite. Again, this was early on. This was back in May of 2021 and then in January. And then over time, as time went on, the base solidified around Mike DeWine. And I think a big reason for that is the fact that the opposition was so fractured. Again, he failed to even get 50% of the vote, but because his opposition was so split up, he was able to win by a really comfortable margin. And of course, in urban counties like Columbus, again, Cincinnati, Cleveland, he's running away with it. And, he did well in a decent amount of rural counties, too. You can't really discount that. Some of these counties, he's getting over 50%. One of them, he's getting 56% in. So it's really not as cut and dry as the Senate primary, where you have the rural areas really dominated by JD Vance. Of course, you have a couple counties dominated by Mandel. I don't know if this is the area of Ohio that he's actually from, this kind of central area, central western part of the state. But either way, it's not as cut and dry as with the gubernatorial primary. You have a lot more chaos, basically, in this one as well. As for the Democratic gubernatorial primary, you have Nan Whaley. There was basically no polling on this race whatsoever. I just know that she was endorsed by Sherrod Brown. So going into this, I expected her to win, but I didn't really expect it to be by this much, considering, we only had 2 polls. So it really wasn't a whole lot I really knew about the Democratic primary on this front. We can also look at some of the key House primaries. I want to talk about the Nina Turner primary real quick, because Nina Turner, who is a very progressive Democrat, she is backing from groups like the Justice Democrats and the Young Turks. She ran in the special election against Shontel Brown last year, back in 2021. She lost that primary race by a closer margin. This time around, though, it was much more lopsided. Shontel Brown was already an incumbent. She already had sort of a record. She was well known. She was backed by Biden, a lot of other big Democratic names, Jim Clyburn, etc. And she ultimately won by about 33 points. So not really close there. Another primary I want to talk about on the House level is, forgot this flips. This is the district where Republican Anthony Gonzalez was the incumbent. He was one of the House Republicans that voted to impeach Trump back in January of 2021. And ultimately he decided not to run for re-election, and his replacement was an extremely pro-Trump Republican named Max Miller. And of course, we have an article here by NBC News. So this was a resounding victory for him. It wasn't even close. And one of the key takeaways I want to talk about here is that Trump is still very much a force in the Republican Party. He's still a kingmaker in the Republican Party. That's one of the key takeaways. JD Vance was a nobody a few years ago. And even when he started out his campaign for Senate, nobody really knew who he was. And over time, as he gained more name recognition and eventually got Trump's endorsement, he shot up into the lead and won the Senate race. So without Trump's endorsement, this would have been Josh Mandel's Senate race. He would have won the nomination most likely, or maybe Matt Dolan perhaps, and they would have been the next senator from Ohio. And the reason I say the next senator is because Ohio is a red state. This is a state that will go red in 2022. It's a state that voted for Trump by 8.1 percentage points, despite the national popular vote going to Joe Biden by 5 points. This is a state that, honestly, if the popular vote wasn't so lopsided in favor of Biden, was more even, would have went even redder, most likely. So this is just, Ohio's a red state now. It's not safe red, but it's a likely red state now. It's on par with states like Iowa. These are former swing states. These are almost like the reverse Nevada and Colorado's. These 4 states were all former swing states back in like 2004, 2008, and now since then have become, Virginia and Colorado have become very blue states, and Ohio and Iowa are becoming increasingly red states. So JD Vance is highly, highly likely to become the next senator from Ohio. And again, without Trump's endorsement, that very well could have been Mandel or Matt Dolan. So the big lesson tonight is that Trump is still in charge of the Republican Party, more or less. He's still a force to be reckoned with. He's still the kingmaker. Max Miller probably would not have won, with 71% of the vote without Trump's support and endorsement. So Trump still has a huge sway in the Republican primary. And Ohio used to be a more moderate Republican state before it became a red state. Back when it was a swing state, you had, it was home to the John Kasichs of the Republican Party. So now you have the, America First Republican Party, the MAGA Republican Party, out of the state of Ohio. Now, another lesson that can be taken away from this is that, incumbent Republican governors are very hard to oust. Republicans tried to do this in Texas. Republicans to the right of Abbott tried to primary him. He ended up winning with over 66% of the vote. DeWine, partly due to vote splitting, but, he ended up still winning by over 20 percentage points. And, these Republican governors that, some on the further right would call rhinos or whatever, whatever your definition of that is, they still hold strong because they have the backing of the party. They have the endorsements. They have tons and tons of cash, and they have the incumbency advantage. And ultimately, in a primary, you're a Republican, you're not really politically engaged whatsoever, or you just support the governor, you're going to go vote for them. So that's a huge takeaway as well. Republicans tried to do this with, again, Abbott. They're trying to do it with Purdue. I suspect in all those instances, they're going to fail. I think Kemp is going to prevail in Georgia. Any other Republican really being primaried on the gubernatorial level is very, very likely to win their re-election, or the renominations rather. So that's another key takeaway. And also another key takeaway too is that progressives just don't really do that well in Democratic primaries overall. Now, obviously, progressive Democrats have some victories in very deep blue districts, but, Democrats are becoming more aware of, the Democratic establishment, rather, is becoming more aware of the quote-unquote threat of progressive Democrats being primaried from the left, and they've become very good at shutting that down. Again, Nina Turner's second defeat is much more lopsided than the first. And again, part of that is because Shontel Brown is an incumbent. She has a lot more money, but progressives have a real fundraising deficit, and that's one of the reasons why they don't really gain traction outside of, deep blue, very urban districts, like in places like New York City, Minneapolis, Detroit, Seattle. Outside of that, where you're in states like Ohio, you're in red states even, or you're in swing states. The progressive message, at least in the Democratic primary, doesn't resonate, even despite their policies being very popular among the Democratic base. When it actually comes time to vote in the primaries, they tend to lose by huge margins most of the time. And of course, there are exceptions. It really depends on the district. Obviously, in 2018 and 2020, you saw progressive upsets in Democratic primaries, but by and large, they tend to lose, and they tend to lose big. So that's another big takeaway from the Ohio primary. But ultimately, a very interesting night. We have lots of more primaries to go, and I want to try and cover as many of them as I can. Now that we have 2022 really underway, I'm going to be uploading a whole lot more, especially because I have a lot more free time in the summer without school. So I'll be sure to be uploading hopefully Monday through Friday every week. But that only comes at your support. So please make sure, if you enjoy my videos, like these videos, subscribe, share these videos, hit the bell notification. But anyway, that's it for today. Again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.